Salutations, everybody. It is Matty here today, sitting down to talk about Avowed. Ladies and gentlemen, last time we talked about Avowed, we went into the gameplay trailer and discussed what we saw there, the potential shift in an art style, and this video, a lot less combative, I promise you, because we're just doing a deep dive into the PC Gamer interview with Carrie Patel, director of Avowed, and we got a lot of information to go through, from single player confirmed, which I know there were very few doubts about it, but some people saw the companions and thought it was multiplayer, all the way up into story details, gameplay details, and much, much more. So if you're new here, you're into Obsidian Entertainment, that means things like Avowed, things like The Outer Worlds, things like God Will in New Vegas 2, and whatever else they're up to, because they're doing a lot of other smaller games, Grounded, Pentiment, things that we'll review here. You're in the right place. Consider subscribing. Let's start off at the top. As the game begins, your character arrives in a remote corner of the world of Eora called the Living Lands as an envoy of the Adir Empire, where you've been sent to investigate a mysterious plague. Quote, "Not everybody in the Living Lands is super thrilled to have an imperial presence in this far-flung land," she said, "so adventure ensues." End quote. All right, first thing I just want to confront, because you see these terms, Plague, Eora, Living Lands, what is all this crap? Do I have to play Pillars 1, Pillars 2? I was actually watching the Xbox Showcase Extended, and it was there that Carrie Patel did sit down and confirm that you don't need to play Pillars 1 and 2, but you'll actually meet characters. Particularly, she mentioned, though, that Deadfire would see a lot of returning familiar faces, but you don't overall need to understand the story from 1 and 2, but that fans who have played these games will see a lot of familiar sights and familiar characters. So, ladies and gentlemen, if you're a little bit worried, if you need to make that deep dive into more CRPGs, you don't necessarily have to. I'm gonna choose to, as I mentioned in our last video, but I thought that was a worthy clarification. Now, she talked about this mysterious plague. If you pay attention to some of the creatures that you see on screen during the gameplay trailer, you'll notice they have this weird fungi on them. And so I imagine this is a big part of this plague that you're sent to investigate. Carrie continues on saying, "As someone who's come through development as a narrative designer, companions are a huge part of the experience and draw for me, both as a player and as a developer. One thing we wanted to do with Avowed was make sure the companions felt really integral to the story. In some games, they're completely optional recruits, but in Avowed, they're deeply tied to the story, tied to your party. We really wanted to create this sense that you're in this big wild frontier, you're going on this adventure of discovery, and you have this small but tight-knit crew with you. The sense you're adventuring through the wilds together, sharing in this discovery and the danger. These people are just as much a part of the story as the larger events that you're getting in the middle of. The way you interact with other characters in Avowed will be similar to the Outer Worlds, where your dialogue options reflect the tone with what you want to use." Quote, "We try to hit the sweet spot where we're writing dialogue options where we invest enough personality for those options to be fun and interesting, but also leave enough space around them so the player can really invest whatever headcanon they built for their character into that option." End quote. So this is the beginning of them starting to touch lightly on a shift in focus. They'll get a little bit more into it later, but one of the driving reasons behind it was companions. And this is an important clarification to make, I think, because again, it goes back to what I mentioned in our first Avowed video after the gameplay trailer, where a lot of folks were saying, oh, co-op, oh, multiplayer. And that's because there was one report suggesting that may be a possible mechanic. It has been confirmed it is a pure single player game. We'll read that in a moment, among many other details. But when you saw all these different characters running around on screen with this, like we'll say, bird's eye view kind of camera angle, yeah, I can understand how people came to that initial conclusion and were less interested, but I think the idea was, again, selling that these companions are a part of the adventure as much as you, which I like that vision, because I think a lot of times it's about you, the main character, which I think is the most important thing to get down, but that everyone around you should be equally important and as invested in your main goal, and it's up to the narrative designers and the writers to provide reasons why that is the case. Patel wouldn't spill much about Avowed's story, but did give me some basics on what form of RPG to expect from Avowed. They say, "You have an established role as the Imperial Envoy, but your personality, appearance, and philosophy and vibe that you bring to that role is up to you as a player to decide. You can play as a human or an elf, but not other races. It's purely single player, no co-op. The world is lightly systemic, think water and lightning interactions, but not the old bucket on the head trick, as in you could block an enemy's vision code by placing it on their head. You'll have 2 companions with you at a time with their own combat specialties and of course personalities. There are several ability trees to progress through, and you won't be locked to a particular class or play style, and you will level up, but the focus is on unlocking abilities rather than putting points into stats to grow stronger. This ability focus, this more, I'd say, meaningful progression is something that we're going to hit on a lot here. This is sounding more and more like the Outer Worlds. Really pretty much reinvented. You know, Outer Worlds was something that as you leveled up, your stats weren't just progressively bumping up. It was more about your skills and investing points into those, but you'd get perks, and those would really define the things in combat. Otherwise, though, no co-op is a great clarification here to have for sure. On top of that, they also talk a bit about other races. As someone who exclusively plays as elves in Elder Scrolls, this probably would be my choice if I made a character in Pillars, so this is welcome to know I can play as an elf here in Avowed. We saw the lightly systemic elements in the trailer, like setting something nearby ablaze. I think that works very fine for everything else the game is attempting to do in the sense of depth. I think a little bit more Bioshocky. Like I always remember when you first get to Rapture and you shock the pool of water and take out everyone else around you. I always like that stuff. It also makes me think a bit of Divinity Original Sin, where that high elemental interaction is a really fun component of the game. So to me, this works well and feeds into one thing I really liked about what I saw in the trailer, which was highly interactive magic systems, which I just don't feel we get a lot, especially in action RPGs where it's just, boom, burn enemy, but you actually don't see like the environment getting scorched around you and things that your fire can interact with. So I like that we're seeing that here in an action role-playing game. No particular class or play style. That sounds very Skyrim in design. A lot of the leveling and progression systems here do remind me a smidge of Skyrim. I am curious to see how this one will play out. I think this is where I would feel more informed, in my opinion, if I had played some Pillars and knew how they established your character archetypes there. I think it's good overall that you're not going to get pigeonholed and that it's going to come down to abilities, which we'll get into a little bit more now. Early in development, when Obsidian decided to prioritize a story, quote, more focused on depth than breadth, end quote, the first-person combat ended up benefiting too. Patel said that there was an example of a piece of Avowed that was surprisingly fun in their first vertical slice, a time when the team has decided on what to commit more resources to and what to scale back on. Combat became a key focus, which should be music to the ears of every Elder Scrolls player who has always found the sword swinging a bit wimpy. Quote, our combat has come along really, really well, and the bones have been there since the beginning, end quote, she said. Patel cited a lot of time spent tuning the feel of swinging a sword versus a mace versus an axe to make combat feel right, but the options available to players seem like more significant elements at play here. You're free to dual wield weapons, wield both magic and melee simultaneously, and as in Pillars of Eternity, there are some old-timey guns available. When I brought up how bored I am of game loot with imperceptible stat differences from one sword to another, she said that has been on their mind too. Quote, the way we've tried to approach that is erring on the side of fewer but meaningful upgrades. If you're upgrading your weapon from one tier to the next, you should feel the difference. If it's a small number change next to the item, that's not going to feel as meaningful as going through an upgrade process, trying your weapon again, and realizing it's doing a lot more damage. Fewer but meaningful upgrade tiers. So a lot of you were correct in what was assumed, which is that there was some type of shift in focus here. Now, I'm curious if that carried over to the narrative and if that carried over to things like the visuals of the game. I still am not buying into that, but there was some type of shift in focus where they were originally going for their version of Skyrim. That was their touchstone. And then they started to think about, what do they do best? This was in a separate interview with PC Gamer. What does Obsidian do best? And I think all of us can agree when you look at from KOTOR 2 and on, and even before that really, they take these hub-like areas and they make them deep and meaningful with a small select few amount of quests, but high reactivity and a lot of player agency. And for me, that's always lit my fire. Maybe not for everybody, and perhaps based off what you saw in the initial Avowed reveal trailer, hearing this is not music to your ears. I don't say it as someone who's just short on time to play games, but when I hear that Avowed is going to be a more focused experience, I think that's great. I think we get a lot of deep as a puddle style open world games, and I like that what Avowed's trying to do is much what the Outer Worlds did. It's got smaller hubs with more choices that I think leave an impact on you and on the world behind you. You know, when I think of the opening zone for Outer Worlds, how there's 4 different ways that scenario can go, to me, that's the impact I'm looking for, because that makes it fun to go back again and again and again. And I hope Avowed is doing the same thing. But I like that they're also focusing that on combat as well. More punchy, meaningful combat is always nice to have. But knowing the upgrades are meaningful, yes, this is overlooked in RPGs often. I'm totally happy oftentimes when I see the big number boost and I hit an enemy and I see bigger numbers. That works for me. Like, I'm playing Diablo 4 right now, and it's an absolute blast, and it is that simple, with the legendary effects playing more of a factor. But what Carrie's describing here sounds a bit to me like, I would actually say Dead Island 2 if I were to pick out a recent example where the meaningful upgrades come in the mods, which you're not always doing. You know, you pack them in one time and you put it all together, and that's pretty much it. And then you just have this weapon of mass destruction. So if that's the path they're going here, I'm a big fan of that, especially because some of the weapons we saw were really unique. I mean, these guns that were almost charging a magic blast, I'm all in on that. I love the sounds of that. When I asked Patel what she hadn't been able to do with the isometric pillars RPGs that she's excited to do in Avowed, she brought it back to the companions without hesitating. Quote, "In most of our games, companions have been optional, which I think offers a wonderful degree of choice to players. But it means there's a limit to how deeply you can tie them to the core story. With Avowed, we decided companions are going to be core. They're going to be part of the experience. And that means we can invest so much more in them and tie them much more closely and personally to the events and the parts of the world the player is encountering. And can they die? This time there was a pause. Quote, you'll have to see," end quote. Patel said, "Until 2024 then." So kind of reiterating what we already got into here, I find it kind of surprising for a lot of these RPGs with many different companions that this isn't naturally a thing that you'd want to do, you know, elevate everyone around you by tying them deeply to the narrative, but it is difficult, so I understand it. Can they die though? Sounds like if this wasn't the case that this would have been a denial, but given that they're close to the narrative, perhaps you'll have those fork in the road moments at major story milestones of like, hey, do you want to go help this person or this person? And there's a major consequence to that. I'm very excited though. Based off what I heard in the trailers, the tone is serious. What I'm hearing here sounds serious. So I'm very, very, very big on this game, and I cannot wait to see more. Based off what Matt Booty recently said in an interview with Giant Bomb, it sounds like we won't be seeing Avowed or really any 2024 games until, well, 2024, probably with some type of developer direct. We'll see at that point, but nonetheless, ladies and gentlemen, just wanted to share all of this news on Avowed with you and get some thoughts and see if any of the wind is starting to blow in a different direction, perhaps. Are you a little more excited? I'm keen to learn it all, so fire away down below. Other than that, be sure to follow me on Twitter, follow me on Instagram. Those links are in the description down below. And a big thank you to all the patrons, all the members who continue to support the hell out of the content here. Stay sexy, stay active. I love you all. Peace.